Hello everybody, welcome to the second part of this workshop on Blumenberg in Jerusalem. You all have Anat Danziger's handout, I hope. Okay, you have. So let me introduce our first speaker in the late afternoon section, so to speak. I have the honor to introduce Anat Danziger. She does not know that I heard her when she presented a wonderful paper at München. So Anat is writing her PhD about allegory and pain in Franz Kafka and Agnon, a project we are looking for. And the title of her talk today is Overpowering the Demon, Tropes of Fear and Fear of Tropes, which is also a rhetorical idea, in Blumenberg's Plato and Hobbes.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Pini for inviting me to speak here today, and thank all of the previous speakers for the wonderful lectures. So I'd like to start with a quote, which is number 1 on your handout. Metaphorology seeks to borrow down to the substructure of thought, the underground, the nutrient solution of systematic crystallizations. But it also aims to show with what courage the mind preempts itself in its images, and how its history is projected in the courage of its conjectures. End quote. With these typically luring words, Hans Blumenberg describes the task of metaphorology, his theory of metaphor. Blumenberg argues for the indispensability of metaphors in the philosophical discourse. His absolute metaphor cannot be replaced by concepts, and refuses to be abducted into the realm of pure rationality. A battle is fought. Blumenberg conjures up the ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry by pointing to philosophy's fear of tropes. As we shall see, this fear of tropes is very often escorted by fascinating tropes of fear. Let us return to Blumenberg's words. I would like to draw attention to 2 elements in the above excerpt from the paradigms of metaphorology. First, the substructure of thought, its underground. The sub of substructure and the under of underground refer not only to Blumenberg's project of exposing the subconscious layers of language, not only to the archaeological venture of tracing the denied history of concepts, the sensual residue that Cartesian philosophy has tried so keenly to cleanse. The notion of underground, I claim, also alludes to a realm of fear tropes. Gory monsters, terrifying demons, deep darkness, foggy swamps, and other horror figures haunt rational philosophy. Of the numerous examples available, I will focus on expressions made by 2 of the most tropophobic or iconoclastic philosophers in the history of Western thought, Plato and Hobbes. The second element I would like to point out is the notion of courage evoked by Blumenberg. The history of the mind is projected in the courage of its conjectures. Courage also characterizes the way the mind preempts itself in its images. Creating images, hypothesizing, both activities are considered by Blumenberg to be courageous. But why is courage needed? The notion of courage presupposes a gap, a fissure that should be overcome. Had Goliath and David been both giants, the latter would not have needed his heroic bravery to defeat the former. For Blumenberg, it seems, figurative language is David, with its courageous suggestive explorations, shot into the space of dialogue like a rock from a slingshot. In front of it rises the colossal shadow of rational language, or more accurately, the reductionist need of philosophy to translate all tropes into concepts. The translatability of metaphors into concepts has dominated philosophical thought on tropes for a century, as Mark Johnson argues. For Plato, however, it seems that there is a disturbing residue that is left after the translation act has been completed. The poet is not only a creator of scant imitations, 3 times removed from the truth of ideas, the forms, but a dangerous seducer. In the Republic, Plato suggests the regulation of feelings as a precondition for happiness, especially those treacherous drives like anger and sex. Poetic imitation, in contrast, and this is quote number 2 on your handout, waters and fosters these feelings when what we are to do is to dry them up, and it establishes them as our rulers when they ought to be ruled. The paradox here is quite apparent. The objection to poetry employs metaphors, a powerful instrument of poetic language. Plato's argument borrows sensual traces from semantic fields of water and blossom, rulers and subjects. Though metaphors are not specifically targeted in Plato's attack on poetry, his general condemnation of poetic language highlights the erroneous and deceitful use of words and phrases. For Plato, tropes are measures of deception, which deliberately stray away from truth. When the carpenter makes a chair, it is the idea of a chair that guides him to build the best imitations his skills allow. If a poet were to describe this chair, say, as an extremely static dog, he would divert the epistemological focus of the listener away from the truth of eternal ideas and on to a fleeting satisfaction of visual pleasures. Another philosopher whose anti-figurative statements are remarkably metaphorical is Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes' argument against metaphors will carry us from the discussion of fear of tropes to its mirror discussion about tropes of fear. In Leviathan, Hobbes determines, and this is quote number 3 on your handout, the light of human minds is perspicuous words, and on the contrary, metaphors and senseless and ambiguous words are like ignes fatui, and reasoning upon them is wandering amongst innumerable absurdities, and their end is contention and sedition or contempt. Like Plato, Hobbes relates figurative language to dangerous feelings and even more dangerous outcomes, like dispute and subversion. But is not dispute a cornerstone of philosophy? Is not subversion the engine of philosophical progress? The genealogy of philosophy, from Plato to Aristotle, from Plato and Aristotle to Kant and Leibniz and beyond, this genealogy suggests that philosophical progress is achieved by a subtle mix of dialogue and contention. Why then does Hobbes describe contention as being negatively charged by linking it to the absurdities of metaphor? I believe that this connection stems from the inner subversion of metaphorical language. While the language of reason aspires to fight its battles in many fronts, but never as a fraternal war, the language of metaphor is constantly subverting itself. While the language of enlightenment desires to be one, the language of metaphor is always, by definition and by etymology, other than one. It carries within itself a rule of perpetual movement. The Greek metapherin means to move above or beyond. In Prospect for a Theory of Non-Conceptuality, Blumenberg cites Husserl, who said that metaphor acts as a resistance to harmony. In moving beyond the unified level of the text, then, metaphor, more than any other tropes, entails a subversive use of language. How am I with time? Do I have enough time? Okay. It is for this reason that metaphor is isolated from all other tropes in Hobbes' attack. This nuance can be clarified by elaborating on the difference between metaphor and allegory. Both tropes contain an implication of otherness. Metaphor involves a carrying over of one semantic field to another. And allegory is etymologically based on other speech. However, the nature of their otherness is different. Metaphor is like a person who has been kidnapped by aliens, experimented on, and then returned to Earth. While allegory is something entirely different. It is a person who flies above the ground in a parallel path, never touching the surface. So, to return to Hobbes' prosecution against metaphors, not only are they senseless and ambiguous rhetorical creatures, they also resemble, and here Hobbes uses an extremely curious simile, ignes fatui. A quick glance at the dictionary teaches us that this term refers to a fleeting phosphorescent light seen at night, chiefly over marshy ground. This is certainly one of Hobbes' most enchanting tropes. Ignis fatui literally means foolish fire, and by using this image, Hobbes captures brilliantly both the foolishness and the fire of figurative language. Furthermore, by integrating this figure in the context of his typical Enlightenment rhetoric, for example in the phrase "the light of human minds," by this integration, Hobbes paints the ignis fatui of figurative language with an ironic shade. It might be as bright and tempting as the clear light of reason, but it is also a delusional trap, just like the poetic imagination in Plato. And if we go back to Blumenberg's notion of courage, in the implied narrative of the ignis fatui, courageous demeanor is required not in order to cross the swamp and get to the light, but in order to admit that the source of light does not exist at all. The pure light of reason and the false light of metaphors are only two tropes in a text abundant with all types of figurative splendor. Above all rises the terrifying image of Hobbes' title, Leviathan, a strikingly powerful biblical image from the book of Job. Hobbes uses Leviathan to describe the ultimate power of the state. Leviathan, or the state, is imagined as a conglomerate body composed of the numerous bodies of its citizens and with the sovereign at its head. The ideal state, claims Hobbes, must be as mighty as the mythological Leviathan. It has to swallow the citizen and sustain him simultaneously. Leviathan is mentioned 6 times in the Old Testament, of which the most comprehensive description can be found in the book of Job. While in modern Hebrew, the word simply refers to a whale, in biblical Hebrew, Leviathan is probably an ominous sea monster, a colossal marine serpent with a petrifying dragon head. In God's answer to Job, he taunts his agonized subordinate with a series of rhetorical questions, many of which feature the image of Leviathan. And I quote number 4 on your handout. Can you pull in the Leviathan with a fishhook, or tie down his tongue with a rope? Can you put a cord through his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he keep begging you for mercy? Will he speak to you with gentle words? Will he make an agreement with you for you to take him as your slave for life? Can you fill his hide with harpoons, or his head with fishing spears? If you lay a hand on him, you will remember the struggle and never do it again. Any hope of subduing him is false. The mere sight of him is overpowering. No one is fierce enough to rouse him. Who then is able to stand against me? End quote. One of the possible interpretations of these verses from Job discusses the arbitrary forces of nature, which men cannot fully grasp and thus cannot ultimately tame. The fearsome roar of Leviathan is equivalent to the awful and wonderful ways of God himself. The Leviathan trope is not a part of a lesson that Job is commanded to learn and follow. Rather, the lesson is a self-reflexive one, namely, that the godly message cannot be coded or translated into human speech. Like in Blumenberg's absolute metaphor, there is always essential residue left behind after the act of translation. Overpowering this fissure between human cognition and God's doing is overpowering Leviathan itself. An interesting variation of the unbridgeable gap between the transcendent realm and the realm of human cognition is introduced in Plato's Phaedo. On the brink of Socrates' approaching death, the entire dialogue is dedicated to arguments for the immortality of the soul. After corporeal death, argues Socrates, the soul shifts to a transcendent realm of ideas, which cannot in principle be comprehended by the living human mind. Again, as in Hobbes' Leviathan, this epistemological fissure is submerged in fear tropes. Socrates mocks his discursive opponent Cebes with these words, number 5 on your handout. You have the childish fear that when the soul goes out from the body, the wind will really blow it away and scatter it, especially if a man happens to die in a high wind and not in calm weather. To this disparaging challenge, Cebes replies, assume that we have that fear, Socrates, and try to convince us. Or rather, do not assume that we are afraid, but perhaps there is a child within us who has such fears. Let us try to persuade him not to fear death as if it were a hobgoblin. End quote. Now, hobgoblin is the English translation for the Greek mormolokeia, which literally refers to fear masks that combine human and beastly elements. By using this trope, Plato activates a dormant fear of hybridity, which suggestively echoes the hybrid of soul and body, the same hybrid that governs the entire dialogue. Ironically, hybridity characterizes the realm of the living, the blending of soul and body into what is called a human being. The death of the body and its separation from the soul represent an opposite movement, a purging act that strives for purity in the realm of eternal ideas. Thus, in an undercurrent which flows beneath Socrates' mockery, Plato reaches out to Cebes and to the readers with a comforting message. The hybridity that paralyzes you with dread is already here, and is essentially what you refer to as life. These Platonic undercurrents, my last paragraph, these Platonic undercurrents muddle the apparently lucid Socratic flow of speech. They also take us back to Blumenberg's substructure of thought. Metaphors are, in Blumenberg's view, the nutrient solution of systematic crystallizations. But they are also, as we saw, the emblem of hybridity. This dialectic echoes the Husserlian dialectic of metaphor. Though metaphor operates at first as a resistance to harmony, it then reestablishes harmony by incorporating that which exceeds a given paradigm of experience. To paraphrase this with a faded hobgoblin in mind, metaphor is both the hybrid master and the route to escape it. Finally, not just in metaphors but more generally in tropes, courage is needed to overcome the Goliath of figurative language. But sometimes figurative language is the David of the narrative, fighting monster with its own inner monstrosities. Sometimes the tropes of fear and the fear of tropes meet on some tropical island, and together borrow down to the substructure of thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anat. Open the floor, and we have exactly 10 minutes.
A clarification question. So if I understand your argument correctly, you want to show us that that this philosopher that's supposed to not using metaphors or tropes are using them actually, and by that you want to say that it's proof Blumenberg arguments or something else. So you want to say, because the typical strategy will say, you will be a Blumenbergian strategy will say, let's read Plato and let's read Hobbes. They present themselves as the enemy of metaphors and tropes, and they use them all the time. So Blumenberg used this as to say, you see, you are saying that you don't need metaphors or tropes, but you are using them.
Yes.
So, but this is the typical strategy of Blumenberg. You are following the same strategy, or you're trying something else to show us that it's a critique of Blumenberg in a sense that we need tropes also in the in rationality, or in this discussion on conceptual discussion.
Yes, it's a very accurate description of my of some of my of a part of my argument. Mainly, what you said, Blumenberg's point is the first step of a more complex flow, not just that ha, you're using images, I caught you, you're using tropes, but how do they do that? And specifically in cases that they are using tropes in the same arguments against tropes. That's very interesting. And also, I think it relates to what you discussed in your lecture about killing fear. So I think it is not coincidental that fear is evoked in so many cases when discussing fear of tropes, and that tropes of fear keep haunting the arguments there.
Another question? Yeah.
Thank you very much for your paper. Just a couple of things. You may know these texts already by Blumenberg, but in case you don't, they would work very well with your argument. One is Licht als Metapher der Wahrheit. Do you know that one?
Yes.
Okay. Where he shows very clearly that the Platonic myth of the cave is a metaphorical myth in precisely the way you argue. So where Plato was arguing against relativism, against sophism, he's actually using a metaphor in order to do that, which you've shown very clearly. The other one where Hobbes comes prominently is Anthropologische Annäherung an die Aktualität der Rhetorik, or in English, an anthropological approach to the contemporary significance of rhetoric. Do you know that? Okay, so you know these things already, right? So there his argument is basically to say that Hobbes's lack of recognition of rhetoric, which in terms of your argument would be his lack of recognition of metaphor and the work that metaphor can do, leads him to an essentially illiberal political theory, right? So that recognition of the fact that we need to use metaphor and rhetoric is for Blumenberg code for liberal political theory, essentially, as I tried to show in my lecture today. So that recognition of metaphor allows one to accept the fact that, as you put it, the absolute truth or the light is not available to us, and all that we have are metaphors of talking about that light, or rhetorical ways of talking about that light. And that in Blumenberg, this is actually a political argument rather than just a philosophical one. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I think it goes back to some of the other talks that we had earlier about this dichotomy of myth and logic, supposedly being a move that is done by Plato. But I think a Blumenbergian, more complex reading of that move would be to say that there are multiple voices in Plato. In the same, in the text, there is Socrates' voice is one of them, but there are other voices. So if we think about this in Bakhtinian terms, it's a dialogical, not just a dialogue, it's a dialogical text. So you have all these voices, and I think it also goes back to your point about oral tradition and written text. We have, I think it's not either this or that, it's the fight itself that's going on in the text. Another thing is that I think there is in Blumenberg and in our conference, I think the tension between argument and that which is not argument surfaces again and again. So I think as a PhD in comparative literature, with a take on philosophy, I think my strategy is to not only have arguments but also beauty. I mean, not just 1, 2, 3, 4. These are my arguments, but also create some sort of a picture which would not just be the truth in an argumentative way, but also aesthetically pleasing. Okay.
Can you just quickly come back on that?
Quickly as possible.
It's very clear, as an example, that in Work on Myth, when Blumenberg is reading the Protagoras, as you put it, he favors Protagoras over Socrates. So as you've pointed out, he favors one voice over the other one for particular reasons. That's what I would say.
Yeah.
Just a small one on that.
Very small one.
Very short one, not small. It's a very short, yeah, and I give it to Ita. Already in the talk of Oliver Muller, we need to raise regarding Plato, the cave. We didn't spoke about the book in which you have the longest piece of Blumenberg dealing with Plato, and in his book on the cave, which was not published, was not translated, to English. But over there, you can see how complex his reading of Plato. For example, around these things with visibility, because the argument over there is that Plato didn't pay attention to the people in the caves, that they didn't want to go out from the cave. And for Plato, it's clear that they want to leave the cave. And he gives voice to these other people over there that understand something that Plato didn't realize, that they maybe you need to ask them if they want to leave the cave. So.
Interesting. It's sort of it's almost a postmodern reading.
Yeah.
I haven't been here when you were introduced, but I felt the literary touch of your speech, and I think this is the tension in philosophy, also with Heidegger. What actually is this tension between literature, language, and philosophy? And I just would suggest a gender point of view. There is a very interesting German Jewish philosopher who just now is being detected in her real serious writing, which is Margarete Sussman, who is really, if you read her texts, you can see that she's very free in using very, very exact philosophical arguments if she needs, but if she wants to make certain points, she uses poetic language, and this just... I have a colleague who is writing on her, who is writing a dissertation on her. So there is this tension, and it, if I may say so, it takes a woman to be more flexible and even make a point, being an essayist and a philosopher and a poet herself. When you lose in a philosophical text this language or another one, so that was just little provocation.
Yes, thank you. I think personally that my take on that is trying to adopt the tension and to make it alive and fruitful. So, thank you.
Only a short question. I liked your presentation very much. It was very convincing. When Blumenberg uses here substructure and underground, perhaps it's right to interpret this in how you did it, but the text is dealing with light as metaphor for truth. And how would you say then in your analysis of the trope here, what the notion of substructure and underground is then connected to? So you interpreted it as right to the hybridity in this monster thing, and so the question is, Blumenberg here, is this the only way to interpret this substructure and underground terminology, or would you say this would be an openness to other interpretations here?
I think, well, thank you for your question. I would say that this is definitely not the only way to think about this. I think there are multiple ways to think about Blumenberg's metaphors inside his theory of metaphors. So yes, the light and there are also the solution of systematic crystallizations. That's very Enlightenment rhetorics. Very much Enlightenment style. So here I would also say that it's I think it's a dialectic between what rolls beneath the ground and the light that we aspire to, the light of reason. And I think maybe we can use the notions from the cave to think about this. There are the prisoners in the cave underground, and there's the philosopher who's going out. And, well, I think the Blumenberg is dealing with the procedure or the way, the path of the philosopher going out. It does not happen at once. It's a long and agonizing way, right? He suffers a lot on this way. So I think it's Blumenberg certainly adopts this this very complicated procedure. I think it's not in Blumenberg. It's not a binary move. So I think this is one of the reasons that we get all these tensions between metaphors of darkness and metaphors of light. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very, very much. I want to close this section with the highest honor Plato can give someone, and say this laughed and said, thank you very much.